Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Well, the Beatles decided in the year 1966 to stop touring. The incident in the Philippines was one of the reasons they decided to do that. So let us see what happened there and how scary things got in that country. In 1966, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr went on a world tour. In its first legs, it started in June, and then in July, the group visited Germany, Japan, and the Philippines. But while they had a great time in their first two stops, things were different when they hit the Philippines. Their first two shows were a massive success with over 80,000 fans coming to watch them, the largest crowd to see the Beatles in concert. But things didn't go so well when they arrived in the Philippines. In the book The Beatles Anthology, the Beatles recall the nightmare. Ringo said that when they got there was thousands and thousands of kids and hundreds of policemen. He said it was a little dodgy. Everyone had guns, and it was really like hot, and then slash Catholic, slash gun, slash Spanish Inquisition attitude. So George's view of when they got there, George said as soon as we got there, it was bad news. George said the normal procedure was that when the plane landed, it would go to the far end of the airfield, and when they got off, Neil Aspinall, who was their road manager, had their diplomatic bags, shaving gear, etc. They would get in the car, bypass passport control, and go to the gig. And then Mal Evans and Brian Epstein and the rest would go and do our passports all at that scene. He said it was different in Manila. A fellow was screaming at us, "Leave those bags there. Get in the car." He said that they were bullied for the first time. It wasn't respectful. George said that in other countries, America, Sweden, Germany, wherever, even though there was mania, there was always a lot of respect because we were famous showbiz personalities. But in Manila, it was very negative, a very negative vibe from the moment we got off the plane, and that frightened them. George said that we got in the car, and they drove off with us four, leaving Neil behind. Our bags were on the runway, and I was thinking, this is it, we're going to get busted. Because Neil said that in their bags there was marijuana, so while the confusion was going on, he put them in the trunk of the limo, and he told the limo driver to take them wherever the Beatles were going. George said they next arrived at Manila Harbor, and they were put on a boat and then taken out to a motor yacht that was anchored out in the harbor, and they put them in that room. So it was very humid there, and they were sweating and afraid. For the first time, they were cut off from Brian, Mal, and Neil. They had a row of cops lined up along the deck around the cabin, and they were feeling really gloomy, very brought down by the whole thing. He said, "We wish we hadn't come here. We should have missed out." George said he never knew why they were taken to the boat. Their manager, Brian Epstein, arrived to them a few hours later. Brian was flustered and said he was with the Philippine promoter, and that guy was yelling and screaming, and he said everyone was shouting, and they took us off the boat and put us in a car and drove us to a hotel suite. After all that chaos, the Beatles awoke to a knocking on the door, and he said somebody came in and said, "Come on, you're supposed to be at the palace." And we said, "What are you talking about? We're not going to any palace." And then the guy told us to turn on the TV. And when we did, we saw on live TV the palace, and there was a huge line of people either side of the marble corridor with kids in their best clothes. And there was a commentator who said, "And they're still not here yet. The Beatles are supposed to be here." So Paul's thought on the incident? Paul had gone out that morning in the Wall Street area, as he called it, and he was taking a lot of pictures. And near that area was a shanty town, and so he was there. And then Paul returned to the room, and that's the moment when they started knocking on the door saying, "Go to the president's palace now." And then Paul said, "No, it's our day off." And he said, "Lock the bloody door, it's our day off." Somebody had invited the Beatles, and they had politely declined. And then they saw on TV Imelda was waiting for them with her blue ladies. And the promoter said again, "You have to go." And Paul said no, and they turned off the TV and went about their day. So now Ringo recalls, he said that he and John were sharing a room, and they woke up and ordered eggs and bacon, and then they were reading the paper. And the breakfast didn't come, so they called down again, and nothing. And then they turned on the TV and saw Madame Marcos screaming, "They let me down." The cameraman was showing empty plates and kids crying. And Ringo said, "We have very politely declined the invitation." And then the road manager, Neil, stated he had asked Brian what had happened, and he said that he sent a telegram telling them no, the Beatles didn't do that stuff for anybody. they wouldn't get involved in politics and wouldn't go to the palace. He said that although people said it was a failure, they played 2 gigs there for 100,000 people after the Marcos thing. He said all the fans had a good time and they really enjoyed it. So George stated the problem at the concert. George said that Brian had a contract made out for the stadium that would, just be a few thousand people. But when they got there, there was almost 200,000 people there. He said he was cheesed off and didn't remember much of what happened after that. And Paul said the next morning someone brought in a newspaper and the front of it said, Beatles snub president. He thought, oh dear, well, say we didn't mean to and that we're very sorry. He said that they were asked to leave that day. When they were leaving, everyone was being nasty to them as they had when they arrived. And so Ringo commented that it really got weird. They were saying, come on, get out of bed, get packed, we're getting out of here. They had no help as they went downstairs, and there was only one motorbike compared to the motorcade that had brought them in. George said that no one ever thought that they hadn't been asked. He figured a promoter had promised her that they would be there. He said Imelda later was quoted as saying, oh, I never liked them anyway, their music is horrible. And Paul noted, when we got to the airport, they turned off the escalators and we had to walk up the steps, and there was no luggage people there. George said, we were carrying suitcases and amplifiers. He said mania was going on with people trying to grab them and other people were trying to hit them. And he said they finally got checked in and went to the departure lounge when a mob came in, and they kept telling the Beatles to get back. And George said he kept his eye on everyone and kept moving along, and he spotted some Buddhist monks and got behind them. Ringo stated people were chanting and people were hating them all the way. And when they got to the airport, people were spitting at them. And then Ringo said that he and John started to hide behind some nuns, thinking that since they were in a Catholic country, they wouldn't beat up nuns. And John said all along the route people were waving and some old guys were booing. John said he was petrified at the airport, thinking that he was going to get hit. John said that the mob kept saying the Beatles were ordinary passengers, but John said, are ordinary passengers hit? And he said he was pushed a lot. He also said he was delicate and moved every time they touched him. So George said they got on the plane, so it was a relief. And they finally got on the plane, and then the plane just sat there. Then there was an announcement that Mal Evans, Mr. Epstein, and Mr. Barrow get off the plane. And then they made Mr. Barrow pay a Manila airport leaving tax. So George said it felt like they were sitting there for hours, but perhaps it had only been 30 minutes. Finally, the guys called, and the guys that were taken off the plane got back on, and they were allowed to leave. George said that they took all the money that they had earned at the concert. He said it was a relief to leave, and he said, I felt such resentment against those people. Paul mentioned when we got back home, a journalist asked George, did you enjoy it? And George said, if I had an atomic bomb, I'd go over there and drop it on them. So Ringo felt like they were going to be put in jail because it was a dictatorship there, and in those days, not a democracy. He said it was his first and last time in Manila. And Neil Aspinall said, I'm sure it made the band think hard about touring, and it might have been one of the last nails in the coffin. George Martin said the Beatles told Brian that they would not tour again. And then Brian said to them, sorry, lads, we've got something fixed up for Shea Stadium. If we cancel it, you're going to lose $1 million. Then Paul said, oops. And so they did do Shea Stadium. And then John said, in caps, no plane's going to go through the Philippines with me on it. I wouldn't even fly over it. We'll just never go to any nut houses again. So the Philippines was a country that the Beatles never experienced before. It was an unfortunate miscommunication. Brian had stated that the Beatles were not going to attend by a telegram, and somehow the Marcos never got the message. So it must have been frightening to have been in such a hostile environment, and the only crime the Beatles did was wanting to have a day off because they didn't get very many of them. And so I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.